Hi, I'm Adrian Howard, and I spend my time working with companies who are having problems where the work of product management, user research, and agile delivery overlap. One of the pain points I've encountered is where teams fail to integrate user research work effectively. Helping teams do that better eventually led to what we're going to talk about today, pace layer mapping. And yes, it's yet another canvas. And product management is full of canvases. You're probably familiar with a bunch already. Google will get you a bunch more, so you know what to expect. First, I will neatly explain the structure of the canvas. Then I'll fill in some of the details from a nice simple example. We'll sprinkle it with a bunch of post-it notes and show how it solves that simple problem for you. And we're done. I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to tell you about the long, messy, complicated journey that eventually led to that pace layer mapping canvas and practice. It didn't spring fully formed out of nothing like the products you work with. We started solving one problem, saw some value, experienced other problems, ran experiments, learned from our experiences, and evolved this practice over time to help solve new problems. So that's the journey we're going to go on today. We started with an alignment problem that we solved with a practice called scale of truthiness. After that alignment problem was solved, the practice evolved into something called lean persona, when it was more of a persistent artifact rather than a one-off activity, which then evolved into something we called incremental persona, which then evolved into something we called iterative persona, which then evolved to add another structure we called flair, which then eventually broadened out and changed a little bit more to what we're now calling pace layer mapping. All of those things were useful at different times for different reasons. They solved some problems and raised some new ones. And for those who want to switch off now, that's the lesson I want you to take away today. That the artifacts and practices and tools that you use for your product development work should be well useful. And when they're not, change them until they are. Don't just take something off the shelf, customize it and build it for your context. So, let's return to the beginning of this story with the scale of truthiness. I started using this with a startup that was still figuring out problem solution fit. They'd done some early customer development work, built some early prototypes, done some MVPs, hired a bunch of people, but we're beginning to have problems identifying and solidifying their target market and their target customers. The details of what they were building doesn't really matter. So I'm going to simplify things and say that they were making Twitter for cats. They hired me to help them get some clarity on those problems with their product strategy and vision and who their customers were. After talking to a bunch of people at the organization, it rapidly became clear that there was a serious lack of alignment on who their customers actually were. When you talk to the product managers, they thought their customers looked like this. When the developers thought they looked a little bit different, maybe something more like this. The designers thought they were building for something that looked like this. And some of the investors were thinking about a kind of customer that was so far away from everybody else. It was actively confusing. Unsurprisingly, this lack of alignment on who they were building for and whose problems we were trying to solve led to a lot of conflict within the organization on what direction the product should go in. And I'm sure the process of herding different stakeholders with different needs is familiar to you. It's what product managers spend a lot of their time doing. So I did what I expect many of you would have done in the same situation. We got all the stakeholders in the same room with a lot of paper, Sharpies and Post-it notes. We even got a few of the end users of the existing product in the room too. We split folk into groups and got them to start articulating who they thought the product customers were, using a few different methods from a few different people. We got them to use simple 4x4s to describe their typical customers, something I first learned from the writing of the excellent Janice Fraser. We got them to use empathy maps to describe those customers' experiences, what they saw, what they heard, what their pain points were, a practice I learned from Dave Gray's work. We also got people to come up with different dimensions and continuums that they could put customers on. Something I learned from Sylvie Alvarez's Lean Customer Development book. Excellent read. We got all those things together. And once the individual groups were happy, we pulled that information off those sheets and artifacts and threw all the evidence and assumptions and wild-ass guesses onto Post-it notes and stuck them up on the wall. At this point, we hadn't got alignment. We, in fact, had a lot of disagreement as people walked the wall and saw how different people saw the customer. People had different conclusions about what their pain points and gain points were, what their behaviors were, what kind of people they were, what assets they had, which is where the scale of truthiness comes in. And it is really simple. We just drew a line right across the length of the wall. At one end of the scale are things we're basically made up, guesses. And at the other end of the scale are things we're really confident of, things we have a lot of evidence for. And we then got folk to justify where their things sat on that scale, which led to lots of interesting conversations about what counts as evidence, the different experience people had with customers and so on. We regularly saw situations where kind of someone was marketing was saying our customers were like this, and someone from the product group was saying the customers were like this. And then we actually had a customer in the room, so we could go talk to them and go, well, I kind of do this sometimes, I do that sometimes. There was lots of discovery there, even though it wasn't like lots of research at that point. It was just getting everybody on the same page about how everybody else saw the customers. Ideas that were mutually contradictory, obviously both couldn't be true, which led to much more productive conversations about how we could figure out what the real state of the world was. People started annotating the board with research activities and experiments to help figure those things out. When things settled down a bit, it became clear that we needed to move that scale of truth further out, because nearly everything that we had discovered needed more research and experimentation to either invalidate or validate it. And as the facilitator for this session, it helped me make sure that a few of the facts that the team seemed 100% certain of actually got checked as well. And while we weren't yet totally aligned in our customer, there was still a lot of disagreement. we could begin to see that some options were much more likely than other options. We had some solid next step for research and experimentation to clarify those areas of uncertainty and hopefully get everyone talking about the same customers in the organization. Now, some folk will be saying at this point that these people should have built proper persona up front, and that might well have helped. Persona, for those who've not used them, are research-based archetypes of our customers that kind of are usually summarized with some kind of persona description. They're an artifact that comes out of user research work. Like this example from Todd Saki-Wolfel. They can be really useful and powerful ways to quickly communicate the results of user research. They can also be misused and lead teams to make dumb mistakes. I've certainly experienced both scenarios in my work. I'm not going to get into the details of the whole personas good versus personas evil argument. Ask Twitter and lots of people will shout at you. But I do love this quote from Jared Spool. Personas are to persona descriptions as vacations are to souvenir picture albums. They're a great reminder, but they don't actually replace the experience, especially if you didn't go on that holiday. A picture album isn't the same as going on the holiday. A persona description isn't the same as experiencing that research process. So, what we had after the scale of truthiness exercise wasn't a persona description. It was more like a snapshot of a bunch of research questions around the company's customers. It's something that, with some more work, might get distilled down to a persona description. But instead of that, something I think that was a little bit more interesting happened. That scale of truthiness artifact got left on the wall, and people started referring to it during product and development work when questions about customers came up. It stopped being the output of a one-off alignment activity and started being a tool people evolved over time and actively updated. Rather than a continuum, people added a little bit of structure and created broad categories for the research on the wall. For example, guesses were things that they'd heard from one customer, or just something a person on the team thought might be relevant. Once they had these broad categories and a way of describing what belonged in them, people started formalizing rules for when and how things moved between the categories. For example, a guess could move to the weak category when we had heard that the problem that it talked about articulated from 5 other customers. Something might move from weak to strong if we could deliver some kind of MVP experiment to validate customers' needs. Things might move from strong to true if we shipped a feature based on that MVP that actually saw real customers use it to solve that particular problem that that particular research insight talked about. We also started seeing things move in the other direction. So if we shipped a feature and nobody ended up using it, we might move that insight back a step because there was obviously something that we misunderstood about how it actually worked. If we had a bit of evidence, but it wasn't actually used to make any product decisions over a period of time, like a month, then we might move it back a step because while it might be true, it wasn't actually being used or useful for our context, and so on. It helped people start building a playbook of activities and practices for working with the user research and making sure it was relevant to the product work that was currently in progress. And because we had this shared resource that product people, user research people, and developers could all come together around, we started having much more productive conversations about priorities in research versus build decisions. Things over on the left-hand side needed more research before we could make sensible product decisions with them. It's probably not even worth doing a little experiment yet. It's definitely not worth building anything. Things in the middle, we had kind of some weak evidence for. Maybe it's time to do some kind of small-scale, cheap bets on what kind of product direction will come out of those insights. And once we got stuff over to True, we had some really solid evidence that those things were used and useful and applied to our customers. So we could start making larger investments, bigger bets, longer term work around the things that appeared there. And this was all useful enough that we wanted to start talking about this bunch of practices together and communicating it to other teams so they could get the value that this team was getting out of it, and helping them get some of the same advantages. So we packaged it all together and started talking about it with other people in the organization, and we labeled it Lean Persona. That's what we called it. This turned out to be a huge mistake and a really bad label. Because when you Google Lean Persona, what you see are those 4x4s that we used in that initial example, and another of those 4x4s, and another of those 4x4s, and another of those 4x4s, and another of those 4x4s. It seems to have become, at some point over the last 10, 20 years, the generic label for those kinds of things. So when people were talking about it and they hadn't had this experience of the scale of truthiness and all that stuff before, they had the wrong things in their head and started doing different stuff. So we changed the name. Since we were building up the persona over time, we thought that incremental persona might be a better label. Did that work better? Let's try it. Let's take that out to different teams and see what they think of it and what they expect that practice to be. Turned out it was another mistake. Because for some folk, incremental persona was communicating the idea that we were delivering bits of the completed persona, one after the other, rather than refining our ideas over time. This illustration from Jeff Patton's excellent book on user story mapping makes this point really well. Incremental is delivery in chunks. It has a start and it has a finish. Calling it incremental set the wrong expectations with some of our listeners. Iteration, on the other hand, is a process. We're refining something over time, gradually making that sketch and low fidelity insights into higher fidelity insights that we're more confident about. So we started calling them iterative persona. This one seemed to stick and be useful. And as more people use this method, we spotted some other interesting behaviors. Remember that backward pushing rules we talked about before, when insights weren't applied and then dropped back to the less confident categories? We regularly saw some aspects of stuff that traditionally sat for some people with persona, like gender and age, disappear off the board and move into the less relevant categories, which is good because those kind of demographic things often drive bad assumptions about customers. There's a great article by Indy Young on this that I'd recommend you read. But despite these problems, people seemed really attached to those photos that were used and little bits of basic demographic information and kept bringing them up again if they did actually disappear off the board, especially if they hadn't been present for the work that pushed it off the board. Even though they didn't end up being useful for driving the product direction. So we just put them in a corner of the board, acknowledging that they existed, but divorced from the actual kind of decision-driving process that was happening in the main sections. So they were there, and we could point to them and talk about them, but also mention the fact that while these might be true, they weren't useful to help drive our product. And folks started calling this flair, which is a joke from the Office Space films. Basically, extraneous stuff that was supposed to reflect something important about a person, but actually didn't in real life. So, now we've added flair. What happened next? After we started using this model with a few different teams and a few different clients, we found some interesting issues about kind of longer term stability and focus. People sometimes got distracted by the new shiny stuff, the stuff that just dropped onto the board, and failed to pay attention and keep an eye on the bigger problems, the longer term issues. And our initial attempt at fixing this was to do a kind of periodic realignment exercise. We'd take a step back every few weeks or months, depending on the bit of work, and take a look at the iterative persona models that we've built up. Sometimes we ended up throwing them away because, we discovered that the entire model really wasn't that relevant anymore to the work that was happening around the overall strategy of the company. Sometimes we discovered that there was a new model. There was a whole kind of chunk of research about a different kind of customer that we weren't looking at until this point. We needed to kick off a whole new thing. It didn't fit any of our existing models. Sometimes we had two different models and we merged them together. We saw that a thing that we thought might be an important difference between two different classes of customer turned out not to be that important at all, and everything could sit together in the same board. And sometimes we did the opposite. Sometimes we split stuff. We had one model and we were seeing some new stuff that was different, and having it mixed in with everything else was making that new stuff hard to focus on. So we split it out into two different artifacts. And that helped. But after we started doing that, after we started doing that splitting out and merging back together, we noticed something else that was really quite interesting. We noticed that different things changed at different paces. Some stuff changed rapidly and some stuff changed much less frequently. For example, a new iOS release came about with new notifications and widgets. And then suddenly our customers are all talking about that feature and the app should really do that and why isn't it doing it yet? So there's this new thing that didn't exist a month ago and now everyone's talking about it and people want to pay attention to it and do things about it right now. Other stuff, other research insights changed much less often. Yes, there's an overall need for live notifications, and that hangs around, but it doesn't change particularly often. And other stuff changes really rarely. Like there's a big, strong underlying customer need about customers wanting to feel confident they're not missing important facts about the project or their bit of work. And those things are well validated, they're solid underlying needs, and they don't change. These different cadences reminded me of Stuart Brand's shearing layers in his book about how buildings learn, which was in turn based on some of the work from a 1970s architect called Frank Duffy. He talked about layers and longevity. Basically, if you look at a house, you look at any building, an office block, a house, there's kind of the stuff in the building, you know, the furniture, the decoration, and that changes a lot. People, you know, get new chairs in, change the colour of the walls, sort of thing. And then there's the kind of the physical space that the building has, you know, the rooms. And yeah, you'll sometimes add a window or knock down a wall, especially if it's an office space with easily movable things. But that happens less often than changing the stuff, you know. And then there's the services like plumbing, electricity, and things like that. And they change less often than the kind of the space of the organisation. And then there's like the skin of the building, and then there's the underlying structure of the building, and finally there's the site the building sits on, you know, the physical ground. And those things are all interrelated, but they change at very different paces. And this tripped off in my head. Brand later talked about pace layers in the context of civilizations, like fast-paced fashion work, which relied on slower-paced commerce, which relied on even slower-paced infrastructure changes, and so on, until you got right down to kind of the natural world and, you know, ground and earth and trees and so on. As Brand says, each layer is functionally different from the others and operates somewhat independently, but each layer influences and responds to the layers closest to it in a way that makes the whole system resilient. And these kind of layers of different paced work was something that we were seeing with our incremental persona. So we moved things around. We separated the insights that we were seeing into layers. Stuff that changed a lot pushed up the diagram. Stuff that changed rarely was pushed down the diagram. And we started calling it pace layer mapping at that point. And we started having things on there that weren't maybe directly customer related. They weren't just about the customers, they were about the product insights or other research things that we found out when we were doing experiments and delivering the product. So, let's review that. We started off with a one-off alignment activity, helping people get confidence in which research insights were true and which weren't, and understanding where everybody sat along those dimensions. We started adding some structure and rules to that initial kind of one-off thing as people started referring to it more and more often during product development work. When we saw that irrelevant information was coming back again and again and again, despite the fact it wasn't useful for driving the product direction, we pulled it out into a separate area. And then when we saw that different bits of research insight moved at a different pace, we started separating things into layers and depending on how often things changed. Which brings us back to that nice, neat canvas We have confidence in the utility of research insights mapped horizontally. We have how often those insights change mapped vertically. We define transition rules for how we decide to move the insights around the map, and those things all together let us do some really interesting things with the team as a whole. We know the stuff over here is weak evidence and needs more research. That means developers can ignore it. Sometimes a bunch of the product people can ignore it as well. We know we have stronger evidence for insights in the middle. We have cues there maybe to do more experiments or build MVPs or make small investments about the product direction and strategy there. But when we shift over to the right, we know we have much stronger evidence here, and we can use this information to drive decisions about building features that we can be fairly confident are going to fulfill a customer need. We can be fairly sure that the bets we make here are going to pay off. We know that the insights at the top are subject to change a lot. So if we are going to make an investment there, we know that it should probably be a short-term rather than a long-term thing until we see how they play out over a longer period of time. Maybe we should just wait and not do the thing there until it settles down. Those are the decisions that layer helps drive. And as we move down the map, we have more and more confidence that these things are less likely to change on short notice. And stuff down near the bottom is a place where we can make larger investments with more confidence. We know stuff in that bottom layer isn't going to change very often. We have history with that. We know that it's not going to be something that is going to be moving around every other week or month. What about the flare? Those useless bits of true information that aren't actually useful for product decision making. We had that separate little category before and it's gone now. Flare kind of naturally ends up in that bottom left chunk of the thing. It doesn't change much, you know, and it's not useful for product decisions, so it gets pushed back to the left and pushed down to the bottom. In fact, another way to view a pace layer map is by treating it as quadrants. Stuff that migrates to the bottom left are things that tend not to change much, and things that we're not confident are useful, and they can generally be ignored. Whereas things in the top left are things that are likely to change, so probably need more research. They need a bit more attention to see what's happening with those things and whether they're going to be useful or not. In the top right, we have some confidence that those are actual customer problems, but things might change quickly there. They might be a transient thing. So short-term investments, short-term product work, smaller bets are the things that we do in that top right quadrant. Whereas the insights on the bottom right are stable-ish and we have higher confidence then in their utility. So they're much more suitable to longer-term investments. They're much more suitable to, yes, we can go and build features on this right now. So why are we saying map and mapping when we talk about using these diagrams? Some of you might be familiar with Simon Wardler's work. and he has quite a strict definition of a map. He says, I often visit new companies and they tell me they use maps. I get excited and ask to look. Unfortunately, what they show me are usually boxes and wire diagrams which lack basic elements of mapping. From a strategic point of view, they're next to useless. They often try to show me their strategy based on their maps, which invariably is the usual endless round of meme copying, consultant, blah, blah, and wasted effort. He doesn't like people calling things maps that aren't maps. And this is Simon's definition of a map. This is a picture from one of his pieces. It's the key elements for Simon are that it's visual, obviously. It's context specific. It's about a particular situation, a particular environment. That there are kind of separate movable components on this map. So, you know, on a military map, there's like armies, and they have position relative to other things on the map. There's some kind of anchor, a kind of a North Star, a compass, you know, a grid, some structure to it. And the components move around, so you can shift things and see how things work as that context changes. And pace layer maps have all of those properties. They're visual. They're about a particular context and a particular bit of research, a particular product context. The components, the insights and other things on the map have positions relative to an anchor around confidence and pace. There is an architecture to it. And the components move around. We have rules for how those components move around. And once we have this mapping, we can start seeing the connections between things more easily. For example, a long-term established need to say current in that bottom right quadrant might drive a more medium-term insight around staying up to date, which might in turn drive shorter term new custom needs about building a new notification widget for a new operating system, or having new push notifications in the web app, or Alexa notifications, or whatever. So people can start seeing the connections between different aspects of research and product work all in one place, which is just super useful. And that's where pace layer mapping is now. This talk and a lot of the links I talked about here will be up on this URL once the conference is over. But like I said at the start, if you're going to take one thing away, or take away this, remember the messy journey we took. From that initial scale of truthiness, one-off alignment activity, through renaming, through adding new structure, adding rules, changing what we called it, adding a new block for things that weren't useful but people keep wanting to talk about, finding that new structure about pacing and different pace layers, and how to interpret that map once we had drawn it. That was a long, messy journey with lots of different clients over a period of years. And that's the lesson I want you to take away, that the artifacts and practices that you use should be useful. And when they're not, please change them until they are. Thank you very much.